Hello, folks, and welcome to this episode of Lawfare Live. I'm here with Paul Rosenzweig from the famed Costa Rica Bureau of Lawfare. Welcome, Paul.
Hey, Ben. Thanks for having me.
So we are going to try something different and radical today, which is instead of our usual format, we're going to try to pioneer a new kind of lecture format that we have never used before. Paul is going to give a presentation involving cybersecurity metrics, and it'll be a bit more of a formal presentation than we traditionally do, and then we will take your questions. And so this is an experiment. I will poll you guys at the end about whether we should do more of these things, occasionally do them, or never try one again. And Paul will, obviously take the results of that very personally. So let me give you a little introduction to Paul, whom I think most of you know. Paul is one of Lawfare's cybersecurity and law policy gurus. He was a senior policy official at DHS in the Bush administration. He has been at various times. He's at the R Street Institute now. He's also been at the Heritage Foundation and worked, of course, for independent counsel Kenneth Starr once upon a time. He is one of Lawfare's stalwart writers and has been doing a project on metrics associated with cybersecurity, which he wrote about on Lawfare the other day, and about which he is going to speak today. Paul, I'm going to make myself vanish in a puff of smoke here. I will be audible if necessary, and the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Ben. First, thanks a lot for inviting me. It's really kind of a delight to be able to experiment like this and see how this is working. It should be fun. And I want to thank you for both the invitation and for the way in which we've been able to collaborate between R Street and Lawfare for kind of this longer project. Let me try and share my screen. We did some work on this earlier, and so I should be able to show it to you. And there, are you seeing it? Ben? Are you seeing? Okay, there we go. Are you seeing my screen now? Yes? Yes, okay, good. Well, then that's good. So I've managed to successfully navigate the computer technology. So here's my plan of attack for the day. I want to tell you a little bit about the broader context of the project that I've been working on, what we've been doing and why, and then give you a little bit of background on some of the results from the project generically, and then dive in at the end to the paper that I co-published last week on enterprise cybersecurity metrics. I co-wrote it with a former DHS colleague of mine, Adam Isles, and I plan to do that in about 25 to 30 minutes, no more, because I figure I'm boring for longer than that. And hopefully at the end, you'll have lots of really, really interesting questions. So the question here is, how do we measure cybersecurity? And I want to start in a slightly different place by asking, let's see. Ooh, how do I get there? Okay. By asking, nope. Okay, there we go. Sorry about that. I'm going to have to go over here. Which do you like better? The art of Wassily Kandinsky or the art of Winslow Homer, right? Now, personally, I like Kandinsky. Many of you may very well prefer Homer. But if I asked you not only which you preferred, but which was better as an artist, I think you'd probably kind of laugh at me, because there is no way of measuring a betterness in art. much less a preference in art. I think we probably all would agree that either of these paintings is better than the recently completed masterwork of my grandson Eli, entitled Mommy and Daddy. But his parents disagree with that as well. And they actually think that Mommy and Daddy is the best piece of art they've ever seen by any metric that you want. But what this really tells us about is that art is essentially innumerate and immeasurable and is based on preferences. But science is at its core the idea of something that is measurable. So this Lord Kelvin, you've probably heard of him because he developed the Kelvin scale of temperature. Put it best, over 150 years ago. When you can measure something and you can talk about it in terms of numbers, then you've got something to talk about. If you can't put numbers to it, your knowledge is really pretty meager and pretty unsatisfactory. So my thesis today, the problem today, is that cybersecurity really is an art. We can't put a metric to it. We can't say that this type of defensive system is better than another. We can't say by how much it's better. We have qualitative metrics, to be sure. I can tell you that using a password is much better than not using a password. But at some level, that's really like saying that my grandson Eli's art is not as good as Winslow Homer's or Monet's or Manet's. So we are at a qualitative set of responses, but we don't do anything really quantitative. And quantitative is, I think, the core of what we need to be able to do in cybersecurity in order to actually make rational resource allocation, risk mitigation decisions. Now, part of the problem with not being able to measure cybersecurity is that the problem is really vast and almost beyond our comprehension in terms of numbers. Some examples that are kind of background setting, if you will. This is one of my favorite things in the entire pantheon of the internet and cyber networks. This is a map of the entire network, the entire ARPA network from 1973. Right? It was recently found in the papers of one of the grand old men who had died, and his wife found it. It was really quite cool. And as you can see, in 1973, there were less than 100 nodes on the network. So we could count it, we could measure it, we could define it. And if we could define how many there were, perhaps we could go and talk about the different differential security on each of those nodes. This is the network today. This is the most recent map I could find. It was done by a company back in 2018. So obviously this is out of date. But what you can see is that there are some broad geographic structure to the network, but that there are so many nodes that quite literally we cannot count them. And, Pache Kelvin, that which you cannot count, that which you cannot measure, you really don't understand, right? One more kind of symbol of the problem for this is the size of the data sphere. In 2021, we will create something on the order of 60 zettabytes of data. How much is a zettabyte? Well, it's so big that I can barely describe it to you, but let me give it a shot. If you started with the very first cave paintings in the caves of Lascaux in France, 15,000 years ago, and if you call that the very first bit of data ever created by a human being, by a human, and you went from then all the way up to the year 2000, so through the time of the pharaohs, through the time of Christ, through the Renaissance through World War I and World War II and early TV and video and all that data, that would be a single zettabyte of data. Human beings more or less created a single zettabyte from their start until 2000. And in 2020, we will reproduce that 60 times over in a single year. And by 2025, 170 times over in a single year. Again, the scale of the network is vast and getting vaster. It's almost like the world were getting bigger and you were responsible for knowing the size of the Pacific Ocean and it were expanding every day. So the problem of numeracy in cyberspace and thus security in cyberspace is seemingly intractable. So let's turn then to narrow it back down. What do we mean by how we measure being secure? And the answer is, instead of actually measuring security now, we measure incidents and events and count events. So for example, we say, who's behind data breaches? And this is from the 2020 Verizon data breach incident report. They assess who's responsible. And 73% are outsiders, 28% are insiders, 50% are organized crime, 12% are nation state actors. So that gives you a little sense of what's happening. And you can see how that changes over time. But knowing that you're being targeted by organized criminal groups doesn't really necessarily tell you how or what you need to do to be more secure to prevent being targeted in the next go round. It gives you event data. It gives you incident data. It doesn't give you results. You think outputs, not outcomes, or inputs, not outcomes. Likewise, we can take metrics on how incidents and breaches occur. And again, this is from the Verizon data breach investigative report, right? And we can see that some incident, if you've got any familiarity with cybersecurity at all, most of the things listed here would be relatively unsurprising to you. There are lots of denial of service attacks. Breaches often occur with point of sale attacks or through cyber espionage or web app attacks, right? There's privilege misuse is the second most common. That's when somebody who you trust breaches that trust. So that's kind of a proxy for insiders. But again, we're talking about incidents, not outcomes, not how to measure more secure. You can, of course, hope to see that the number of these goes down in a year rather than up, just as we would hope that the number of murders goes down in a city rather than up. But you can't really express that in terms of, are you being more secure or less? Even if I tell you that the number of murders is going down in a city, we don't know, for example, whether that's because the number of murders is actually less or because we're discovering less of them. That's not terribly true of murders, which are fairly self-evident, but robberies, rapes are notoriously undercounted and underreported. And so if the incidence of rape in a city is going down, we don't know if that's because people are reporting it less or because we're actually doing something successful. I see a question in the chat from John about where would social engineering appear here. Typically, that's not on this particular chart. Because it doesn't describe the methodology of how it happened. It's describing it's not describing the exploit. It's describing the payload, if you will, or the methodology of exploit, rather than the vulnerability itself. I'll come back to that though in a second. So remind me of that. Okay. Similarly, we can talk about the cost of cybercrime, right? And this is, business enterprise compromise and email activation compromise. Clearly the largest loss. Confidence, romance, that's actually part of your social engineering there, John, is we can ascribe most of the confidence, fraud, and romance to kind of some form of social engineering investment. But again, The dollar value of cybercrime is going up, and it's going up all the time. What we don't know is whether our efforts to slow it down are being effective, because we don't know how many new entrants there are into the cybercrime field. We don't know how much loss is going unreported because people are concealing their victimization because they fear adverse consequences, reputational mostly, sorts of thing. So what I'm trying to express here is that as a first approximation, the field of cybersecurity does not adequately describe in metrics that we can use whether or not an enterprise is or is not optimizing its security. And I should pause there and just say, all of this is about risk management, risk mitigation. It's about optimizing security. It's not about eliminating insecurity, because nobody thinks that we can eliminate cybercrime or cyber loss or cyber insecurity any more than we think we could eliminate murder or rape or robbery in the physical kinetic world, right? So our goal here is to identify what the right amount of investment of resources is. And by resources, I mean everything from money to time to attention, to prioritization over other possible ways to spend those things. So this is all about risk mitigation and risk management, not about elimination of cyber risk. And so I approached this problem by asking the question 3 or 4 years ago, could we get ourselves to a point where we were developing metrics of risk that would be useful for an enterprise, useful for the customers of an enterprise, useful for outsiders who interacted with an enterprise. In my idealized world, I'd like to have a system in which an enterprise could say, I am secure to this extent, and an insurance company, for example, could rely on that assurance, could audit that insurance, and could say, yeah, that's true. We're going to give you a better rate of cyber on your cyber insurance product. So that led us to begin to think about a deeper model. I don't want to say a better model, though I actually think it's better, but I don't want to mischaracterize people or say better, because that would be inappropriate. So the first thing we did in beginning this program, and now I'm kind of beginning to tell you a little about the project that I've been doing for the last 3 years at R Street, is ask people what they think of the problem. And I found basically 3 monkeys, 3 different, they'll see no evil, hear no evil, speak no evil guys. It's not about evil, but when I ask some folks about whether or not they could numericize the security of an enterprise, they said, oh, sure, we've got that. We already do that for our enterprise, and we know exactly how secure we are. And I said, great, show me, because I thought, wow, this is fantastic. People understand this, and I've misunderstood the problem. And they said, well, no, we can't show you because it involves proprietary information about the enterprise, both as to our security profile and as to the methodology by which we assess our own security profile. So we're not going to be able to share that with you. And I thought, well, that's really unsatisfactory. Having a security system that relies upon self-certification is kind of like having a security assessment of cars that relies upon the auto manufacturer to say, don't worry, trust us, we got this. This Pinto is totally safe, and we've got the metrics for it. We just can't share them with you. So that's unsatisfactory, right? The second group of people were at the opposite end of the spectrum. They said, great idea, Paul, absolutely impossible to be done, right? You're dealing with adversaries who, unlike most risks, most material risks like to cars or the risk of a hurricane, are adaptive human adversaries who change their tactics. And so as soon as we plug one hole, they look to find another. And since the size of this space is growing at an exponential pace, it is effectively infinite. And infinity minus 50 is still infinity. And so every security feature you put on, while they may be qualitatively good, and we're not saying that they're not qualitatively good, but you can't ever do a metric of it because, of course, it's impossible to measure a reduction from an infinite amount of risk to a lower level of infinity. Well, that's also really depressing, because right now ICT systems of the sort we're talking about pretty much are 25% of the global economy. That's a rough number, and it varies from country to country. It's more in the US, it's less in North Korea. But the prospect of not being able to decisively assess and numericize the security of 25% of the global economy is really just like, well, that's a failure. If we can't do that, we're really in bad shape. The third group, which was the major middle ground, said, this is a great idea, Paul. We'd love it. We have no idea how you can really do it. When you get something, come back and talk to us. And so that set me on my way of trying to find something. And the first thing I did was try and define what it is I would think of as a good metric. What it is would be useful to the world. And if David Priest is on the line, I apologize, David. This is my one word slide. He told me I couldn't use words in a slide, but I'm going to use this one slide with words in it. Because as I thought about it, there were really 7 different criteria that would define a metric or a suite of metrics, not just one, but many, that would be truly valuable if we could develop them. First off, they had to be transparent. They had to be the types of things that you could show to the world. So none of this, oh, we've got an internal metric, you'll have to trust us. It had to be something disclosable. It had to be something that was auditable. So it had to be a real test that you could put real numbers to, and that somebody else could actually test those numbers out. So this is Lord Kelvin's proposition. It also had to be reproducible. So we had to be able to iterate it over and over again and get essentially the same result within, confidence limits, so that it wasn't like at one point you get an 85 and the next time we do the same test you get a 12. It had to be scalable. This had to be something that we could use all along the vast network that we were trying to figure out whether it was safe or not. If it was just usable, by a single enterprise with a huge amount of effort, that wouldn't really work. It had to be useful, right? So it had to be actually, in the end, we think, measure security in a way that we thought was an accurate depiction of the real security state of an enterprise, whether it's a private enterprise or a government enterprise. It had to be something that everybody agreed upon, or a large number of people agreed upon. If Ben and I had a private system and nobody else agreed that it was a good one, that would suck. And it had to be reasonably widely adopted. That is to say, it had to be something that in the end we would sell to, not monetize, but sell as a general proposition to people. So that's kind of where I begin this access question. And before I turn to the paper I did on Lawfare the other day and kind of talk about that in more detail with you, I did want to mention one other approach that I also wrote a paper about for Lawfare about 6-8 months ago. And this was about a fintech company that says that it can impute cybersecurity readiness from external data about the security of an enterprise. And lots of cybersecurity companies don't go inside an enterprise. They look at the outside and they see what your exposure is, for example, to the dark web and things like that. So this fintech company, it was called CyberHedge, married that to its own assessment of the financials of a company, including its research and development investment, that sort of thing. And what they discovered was that they could give, what they think they've discovered is that they can give a 5-star rating like a Moody's or an S&P rating, 1 to 5 stars, about the cybersecurity of a company, that would give you a sense in advance that the company was at cyber risk. And then, of course, since they're a fintech company, they run a hedge fund and they bet against that. And I was sort of uncertain about that. Sorry about that. I was sort of uncertain about that until they told me that they had put SolarWinds at 1 star 6 months before the breach occurred and 12 months before the breach was publicly announced. So I thought that's pretty cool. Now, whether or not that's reproducible and they can do it more often is something. It's not fully scalable since it's really only for publicly traded companies, and it's probably not that transparent because they want to make money off of it. But yeah, we're starting to approach an idea of actually being able to measure the cybersecurity of an enterprise from someplace outside of the enterprise. So now let me turn to the paper I wrote the other day on enterprise measurements. And again, I wrote this with a fellow named Adam Isles. He's a principal at the Chertoff Group, where I'm a senior advisor. So this is sort of what they do professionally. And I'm not doing that to sell them at all, but just as full disclosure, if you will, so that you know where this is sort of coming from. They start with the idea of trying to define threat information more broadly, so that they are going to be able to assess the threat to an enterprise, not by looking at the enterprise itself exclusively, but by looking at a host of factors around the enterprise, what activities they're seeing in people probing the enterprise, what threats should they be looking for, what have we seen in the past in this enterprise, what do these threats do, how does it work? So this is really taking an enterprise and peering under the hood of the enterprise. So that's part one of this plan. Part two of this plan is a realization that bad actors can change what they do on a dime to a large degree, but there are some parts of what they do that they can't change that readily. And these are known as TTPs, techniques, tactics, and practices, right? And those are the ways in which, call it essentially, the playbook for bad guy actors, much like the playbook for a football team, if you will, right? A football team can change, can put people in motion and can misdirect people and can change its formations all the time. That's stuff that's easy or trivial to change. But in the end, the core plays themselves are part of a long playbook that the players had to learn for a long bit of time. And it's those tactics and techniques and procedures of the football team that form the core of how its offense functions and that are difficult to change. They can install a couple new plays every week, but they can't change offensive coordinators that readily. And if they do, they need several weeks or months of practice to learn the new playbook altogether. Likewise, bad guy actors who are malicious in their activity can readily change the hash values of some of their attacks, the IP addresses they use, even their domain names. But what they can't change that readily are their methodologies for intrusion, the particular coding exploits that they use to get inside a system. And MITRE, the FFRDC, a federally financed research and development center, has begun cataloging these TTPs, these tactics, techniques, and procedures against the actors themselves. You will be unsurprised to learn that much like football teams are different, right? The Washington Redskins used to run all the time, and the San Francisco 49ers were famous for their West Coast offense. Much like football teams differ in their play structures, bad actors, malicious actors, differ in their TTPs. or to put it colloquially, the Russians are very, very different from the Chinese, and both of them are very, very different from the cyber criminal actors who are propagating ransomware around the globe right now. That realization lets us actually begin to look at an enterprise and assess its security through a comprehensive understanding of the threat actors, and their techniques and principles. So this is my last slide, and I borrowed this one from the Chertoff Group, who were kind enough to loan it to me. It's really quite a little bit of a word salad slide, but it captures the idea here in a really effective way. If you are an enterprise and you want to assess and measure your cybersecurity, you've got to start at the beginning. You've got to identify what your business attributes are, what it is about you that makes you a company, right? And that's really different. A business payment processing company is very different from a bank. Both of those are different from a transportation company or a trading company, or one or a company that makes its market in selling consumer goods like pizza. You'd be surprised at how deeply engaged in the cyber realm Domino's and Papa John's are these days. I recently did a study of those. It was fascinating how much they use cyber systems to enable both the production and the distribution of their product. So what are your key business attributes, right? And then who's a threat to them, right? If you're a payment system or a commercial facing system, your threat stream actors are people who want to steal money from you, or possibly steal profiles and privacy data about your customers. If you're a bank, they want access to your insider information. If you're an insurance company, they want to know who you insure and what risks you insure them for and for how much money. If you are a government enterprise, you want to know they want to know where the national security secrets are, and so on. So you need to take both open source information about what bad guys want and marry that to your understanding of your own business enterprise. And that gives you a relatively narrow range of people who are your threat actors. If you're an NGO, you could easily be the subject of political action by malicious cyber actors who are script kiddies or otherwise relatively trivial actors, but who have a real political motivation. If you're a business enterprise that is selling a good, your threat actors are going to be a different category. And if you are a hospital, you're going to be subject to ransomware attacks from people who want to get money from you. It's really that kind of simple. And you now know which of your systems are most at risk from which people. And then we can go to step 3, right? The map those threat actors to their known tactics, techniques, and procedures, the things that we have seen them do before. And then you have a threat model of exactly what it is, or not exactly, but most of what the malicious actor is likely to use in trying to approach your enterprise. Some malicious actors use social engineering of the sort that John was asking about earlier. And so your threat model is based upon the vulnerability of your personnel to phishing attacks or man-in-the-middle attacks when they try and access their own social devices, their own social media on devices that are both their own personal device and part of your system. You can risk rate them. You can sort them out. You can rate them by priority. And then you can map that major threat to your priority defenses. Maybe you need to do training for your employees. Maybe you need to, maybe the threat is going to be experienced through people who enter simply through phishing and then move laterally within your systems. So you're going to need enhance intrusion protection systems. Maybe your biggest threat is from people who are accessing your system through VPNs because you're doing a lot more work outside the system. Why did you?
Go ahead. If you want me to bring the slide back, I will.
Okay. Well, okay, that's good because that's good. So that was a surprise to me. So sorry about that. So maybe so you have this entire sense of oh shoot, what happened there? There we go. Sorry. You have this entire suite of countermeasures that you can take, and you should. And then, and this is the best part where we get to numericizing it, you can test after you've deployed new countermeasures how effective they are in reducing your risk. You can start by doing a baseline of what your risk level is right now. You can add a system to it, test its effectiveness, add another system to it, test its effectiveness as well. Are they, in fact, blocking or detecting your relevant activity? And you don't have to let that happen exclusively in the real world. There are lots of new red team modeling systems that will enable you to do attacks inside of virtual reality and see how effectively are done. And so in the end, when you blend all this together, and I've probably talked for long enough, you can give your enterprise a number. And what we're doing at the Chertoff Group is everybody knows credit scores because almost everybody's tried to get a mortgage at some point. And so we're using that as a model from 250 to 900. And you can give yourself a rough number of what your cybersecurity score is, and then you can iterate on the process. Do the entire assessment again, deploy something new, and see how your testing and assessment improves. Is it my biggest thought about challenges with this model is that it's probably not as scalable as we would like because it involves a lot of looking under the hood of an enterprise. But one of the things that I want to trial, and I'm talking to the folks at CISA about trying to do this, CISA is the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency, is maybe trial it at a sector level, right? Which is to say that if you're a retail enterprise, for example, the very largest ones like Home Depot can probably afford their own efforts like this. But if you're a small or to medium business retailer, you can't. On the other hand, your threat model probably doesn't look very different from the guy next door who's also a small business retailer. Even if you're selling shoes and he's selling clothes and the guy next door is selling fruit, you're all small business retailers with the same model. So we're going to see if we can maybe do this at a sector level. Anyway, what I would close with is just to return to where I started. So long as we can't put a number on it, it's not science, it's art. And art is great. I love this picture behind me. Not picture, it's actually a tapestry behind me. You may hate it, but I can't tell you how much better it is than the tapestry you have that you like and that I hate. We need to be able to put numbers to this. Otherwise, cybersecurity will never get the investment it needs because we will never be able to make resource allocation decisions and risk mitigation and management decisions that are sensible. We'll always just be guessing. And maybe there'll be educated guesses, and that's not bad, but it isn't what we need. And with that, Ben, I'll turn it over to you.
Excellent. Whoops. Thank you, Paul. And let me just bring myself on screen and slightly darken myself because I seem to be washed out in color now. So as always on Lawfare Live, we are here to take your questions, or in this case, I am here to shepherd the conversation and Paul is here to take your questions. So if you have a question, please flag it in the Ask a Question box. I will bring you on screen to pose it unless you specifically ask me not to. And we're going to start with John Bordeaux, who did just that and who asks, how might this approach be applied to supply chain risk, such as the SolarWinds situation, where network management software undermined enterprises who may otherwise rate well in this model? Cloud computing also fits into this question.
Well, that's a great question, John. And the really, oh, there you are.
Nope, that's Hans, not John.
Okay, he's next. The really short answer is business is booming post SolarWinds. But the longer answer is this. I think that what SolarWinds reflects is a bit of a blind eye to the supply chain risk management part of the equation. People didn't perceive this as a vector of risk, and therefore, had we run this model 2 years ago, we might very well not have included that as a factor. But now it is a factor, and it is indeed one of the first factors we look at, which is the source of your code, your software, and the risks associated with that software management and supply chain management system. So it would now get a separate, essentially, realization that that's a possible threat stream. It would now be married to literally a new set of entries in the MITRE ATT&CK system about how that type of tactic and technique is particularly salient in malicious Russian nation-state actors. We haven't yet seen it, for example, in ransomware attacks or criminal gangs. And so, if your threat model doesn't include risk from nation-state actors, probably the supply chain management piece is a lower priority still, because it hasn't become a part of what's at risk to you. But if you are at all, for example, in the DIB, in the defense industrial base, manufacture anything that might be subject to nation-state interest, that's ramped up. And now all of a sudden we're identifying new countermeasures that are going to be necessarily deployed in order to mitigate that risk. And eventually we'll be able to test the effectiveness of this and grade it. So one of the beauties of this system is that it's modular and it's always being updated. One of the downsides of this system, but it is true of being the downside of just about any enterprise risk management system, is that it doesn't know what it doesn't know, which is to say that there's always something new and novel in the exploit realm that we've never seen before and that we haven't even thought of, but some creative malicious actor has just thought of and is starting again. And the first bite always hurts, and there's nothing in enterprise risk management that can eliminate that possibility. We can just make our responses more rapid and effective.
All right, Hans, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Ben. Thank you, Paul. It seems to me that if you looked at the world, in the cyber world, expecting changes to TTPs is not necessary as long as they work. And in most cases, it's not hard to hack somewhere. So is the change of TTPs a good metric?
Well, no, in fact, kind of the other side of that. The idea here is that changing TTPs is rare and harder than changing hash values or IP addresses or even DNSs. And so if we target our countermeasures based upon an understanding of TTPs and the TTPs of particular threat actors, we have a better prospect of actually forcing them to change their TTPs in the end to get back at us. And that is more difficult for them. And essentially takes more time. So it's their vulnerable point, right? I mean, if we ask what is the hardest thing for a bad actor to do, it's to change his TTPs. It's not to change his IP address, which he can change like underwear, right? It's not to change his DNS, which he can get a new DNS. It's a little annoying, but he can get TTPs. That's learning, that's studying, that's harder. And so our goal here is to target our countermeasures more accurately at the TTPs rather than at IP address blocking, which I can block a bad guy's IP address tomorrow and it'll be on a different IP address the day after, actually probably an hour later. It doesn't take him hard time at all. Does that help?
It does. I'm not sure I agree in the sense that changing TTPs doesn't become hard until you need to use 0 days. Until then, it's just basic research. Even I could do it.
Well, that's a great discussion, and we actually should have that one in more detail offline. I mean, part of what is the reality here is some of what this model will sell in the end is a divergence effect, right? It's if I make your TTPs less effective on my enterprise, what I'm really doing is just making Ben's enterprise more at risk. And so the long-term goal here is actually probably something at the network level, at the kind of global hygiene level, which is the extent to which properly identified countermeasures have been adopted in a large category of enterprises. And when that gets big enough and your victim space gets small enough, you'll have to invest in finding new TTPs in the end.
Yeah. We have corresponded before by email, so I'll respond in email and let someone else talk now, and we can,
excellent.
We can discuss this.
Oh, that's right, we had.
All right. Thornton asks, this all sounds great, but what can be done if major parties, large corporations, local, state, international governments, etc., accessing the internet don't participate in this cybersecurity regime?
Well, now you're taking us up a level. My goal in having metrics is eventually to have law and policy incentivize better behavior. The reality right now is you can't force anybody, you can't cajole anybody to be better because you can't define what better is. So the metrics project is, in my mind, a precursor to the next question, which is, okay, we now have a system that we think is reasonably effective. What do we do with it? How do we use that? One of the things that's happening in the policy and law space is that Congress is moving towards consideration of the creation of a Bureau of Cyber Statistics, which was a recommendation from the Cyberspace Solarium Commission and is, sorry about that, and is something that I've written another couple of articles on Lawfare about that I encourage you to read. And that institution, if it ever gets created, would start to define both which metrics it wants to measure, and then I have no doubt that lawmakers, policymakers, insurance companies, boards would wind up taking those metrics and using them to inform some of their broader decisions. So, for example, in the insurance space, you can't get insurance for fire unless you measure, the fire risk to your building against an underwriter's lab code of metrics that have been well accepted. I can imagine a world in which insurers, once BCS has a governmentally accepted, set of metrics, in which insurers use those metrics, at least in part, to define insurance rates. And that wouldn't force anybody to measure their security, but it sure would incentivize them to do so. I could also imagine a world, and this would be probably a much different world, in which use of those metrics were mandated, and it became a regulatory regime inside the U.S. government. Personally, I wouldn't want to see that regime. I would think that the private sector method would be much better. But my fundamental point is, if you can't measure it, you can neither regulate it nor assign liability nor assign risk in any way, manner, shape, or form. So I think my fundamental answer to you is going to be, I don't know how or if we should force people to do it. I just want to build something in the first instance that is useful, and then we'll see what use is best. We best put it to.
All right, we have a question from John Bordeaux again. What is the moral and legal requirement to share damaging information about an entity of high importance? For example, if you learn that a SCADA vendor is at high risk and not fixing.
Well, who is the you in that question, right? The legal and the legal one certainly differs whether the you is the FBI or a white hat hacker who's just bopping around looking into things, or an insurance company. Everybody has different legal obligations, and concomitantly, I would say probably most of them think that they have different moral obligations as well. I'm sorry about that. I tried to turn that off, and I thought I had. But
it's good to have Clint Eastwood periodically interrupt.
Yeah. Well, that's my ringtone.
It's mine too, actually.
Oh, good for you. So to answer your question, let's start with the government, right? What, for example, is the legal or moral obligation of the NSA when it identifies a vulnerability in an important SCADA system, say an electric grid, a major electric grid of the United States? The government says it has no legal obligation to disclose that. And it also says that as a matter of equity, it engages in a equitable disclosure discussion process inside government, at which it attempts to decide whether or not disclosing that so that it can be fixed is the right course, or hoarding that vulnerability because perhaps it's also a vulnerability in the Russian electric grid, and we might want to use it against the Russians someday, is the right thing to do. The government will tell you that they disclose roughly 90 to 95% of what they find ultimately, and they hoard about 5%. That's, how they do that is sort of behind closed doors. You and I don't get to play in that game. Though if Ben ever invites Mitch Daniels on board to his In Lieu Of show, Mitch could talk to him about it at some length, because he invented this idea when he was Obama's cyber director. In the private sector, if I'm an outside white hat hacker, most large SCADA companies have now, and most large software companies have developed what are called bug bounty programs, where they'll pay you to tell them what the bounty is. And that's a good thing. Many of them also use, many white hat hackers also now use what they call ethical disclosure programs, where even if they're not getting paid, they'll tell the SCADA system about it and give them an opportunity to fix it, and then only make a public disclosure if the SCADA system is, in their judgment, delaying the fix, which they sometimes do because it's expensive or they don't care, or for any number of a host of reasons, it's hard to fix. So you've asked a complex question. For myself, when clients come to me, the main thing that I advise them about is disclosing in a way that avoids their own personal liability, because often there's a possibility that somebody will say that they have broken a law in finding this vulnerability, and for doing the right thing, they shouldn't go to jail. That's kind of my bottom line.
Hans, you get the last question today. And before you ask it, reminder to everybody who has not yet answered the poll to answer the poll. And reminder to everybody who has not signed up for Lawfare Live on our Patreon account, please do so, because that is how we bring you events like this, which you guys seem to be voting overwhelmingly that we should do often or very regularly. So Hans, the floor is yours for the last question.
Okay, thank you again. I want to pitch the idea that you can measure the vulnerability of organizations, so not threats, but vulnerabilities, by, for example, assessing whether there is a CISO who is the peer of the CIO, right? So not a submersive, that's the wrong word, but also by measuring, are there regular monthly reports by the CISO saying this is where we're vulnerable? If you track the number of machines that are fully patched, you can see if there's a long-term trend that goes up or down. You can see how many devices can be fully patched, because frequently people are running stuff, particularly in their industrial control systems, that are way outside of any support timeline, yet they're still connected to the internet, which seems to be asking for trouble. Thank you again.
So that's a great point. I would say that my answer to you is both, right? A lot of the work that people like the fintech company I mentioned earlier do by assessing a corporation from outside is essentially process compliance work, right? Having a CISO, having an outside audit committee, having a robust, well-funded patching program, having a robust, well-funded employee training program. All those things are indeed measurable. My own view is that in the very, very long run, the optimal measurement of security of a corporation will be some blend of those two. And then I'll throw in a third vector that you haven't mentioned, which will be no surprise to Ben because it's part of another project that he and I are working on, which is also to some degree the security of an enterprise is related to the legal and policy governance substrate within which it works and within which it exists. And without being too categorical, it means to me that I have questions about Kaspersky because it's venued in Russia, and about Huawei because it's venued in China, that I have less of with respect to the security of enterprises in the United States or England or Holland or even Argentina or Costa Rica. So I think all three of those ultimately go to the degree of security and the degree of trust, if you will, that one can have in the products and the enterprise itself. And so I don't see any of those as a one size fits all silver bullet answer. And I agree with you completely, Hans, that a corporate attitude is important. In fact, I'll generalize that and end with an aphorism that another friend of mine once told me. He said, show me a company that has bad financial controls and doesn't keep track of its money well, and I'll show you a company that has bad cybersecurity controls. And I assume that that's probably uniform, irrespective of the fact that they're probably two completely different departments under two different people, and it's because of the culture of the corporation.
We're going to leave it there. Paul Rosenzweig, thanks so much for speaking with us today.
Thank you for having me, Ben. I'm delighted to have been with you, and I hope everybody enjoyed themselves. If you want to reach out to me, I've got I think it's P. Rosenzweig at lawfareblog.com or something like that. I think happy to chat, or P. Rosenzweig at rstreet.org.
And obviously, if you've enjoyed this episode of Lawfare Live, tweet it. The Crowdcast video will remain I will be uploading these at some point to YouTube, but please do share these episodes. We're trying to build audience for this, and it's a big experiment. Thanks so much for joining us today. We will be back soon.